And thanks to the COVID, people can take it away they can keep it, which is nice and very generous of ZKM.
Okay. Welcome you to the Terrestrial University, which is a program contributing and to support the exhibition Critical Zones at ZKM. I'm very happy to welcome famous guests like Bruno Latour, like Francesca Düsseldorf-Misa, like Markus Reimann, and the group Terrestrial Agency, and Bettina Korinthenberg. He's one of the co-creators of the show, Critical Zones at ZKM. And I would address my first question to Bruno Latour, then to Territorial Agency, and then to the Düsseldorf-Misa Academy and Ocean Project. The reasons why I would ask first Bruno Latour is because our cooperation between the Düsseldorf-Misa Foundation and ZKM is concentrated and focused on the work of Territorial Agency. And as far as I'm informed, Düsseldorf-Misa and Markus Reimann have discovered this artistic group at an exhibition at ZKM, which was called Reset Modernity. Therefore, I ask Bruno Latour to speak a little about his exhibition, Reset Modernity, and why he has included the group and discovered the group Territorial Agency. Dear Bruno.
Well, I've known Anne-Sophie and John for a few years before, and I was very impressed by the way they dealt with continental space. In this case, in Reset Modernity, the amazing work, which was of a gigantic size at the end of the show, on the way the oil industry were actually impacting on space in huge maps, which were the end, so to speak, of a Reset Modernity show. I'm not going to explain what Reset Modernity is, because sometimes people get lost with the word reset and then with the word modernity, and it takes a lot of while. And we are not talking about continental this time, we are talking about the sea. And I was very interested in the fact that after this huge and incredible installation, Anne-Sophie and John were taking the sea as a sort of equivalent of the way space is appropriated. And it looked counterintuitive at first. I mean, sea in the whole etymology and in the old legal framework was supposed to be free and open, and only continental space was supposed to be appropriated. But in the show, which we now are going to talk about for this exhibition, Critical Zone, they realized that it was actually not true, and that sea was as much appropriated as the land, and in many ways by the same people and in the same ways. So it's a very important extension and a way to fight the opposition between land and sea, which, as we know from Carl Schmitt's work, is supposed to be a very important divide, but no longer it's the same space. The second reason why I was very interested in having them twice in the show is that critical zone, in the way we frame it in the show, is often connected too much to continental crust, so to speak, to the floating continent, the granite floating continent, and not so much about the sea, even though there are some critical zone observatory in the technical sense of the word on sea. So I think it was very important to have the ocean being presented, but not as exterior to the critical zone, as fully integrated in the critical zone. And the beauty of a data set that Territorial Agency is so good at focusing, gathering, aesthetizing, and putting into place is to make this connection between the sea and the land. So twice, it's very important to have Territorial Agency, and I hope we will have many other occasions to benefit from their work.
I can confirm your point of view. In the show, Reset Modernity, territorial agency had a gigantic installation. And in this gigantic installation, it showed the effects of the Anthropocene on the land. We had many points on gigantic maps, many points where where the people extract oil from the land and how they destroy the oil. It was really tremendously effective. But now, interestingly, you show us the effects of the Anthropocene in the ocean. So not in the land, but now in the ocean. So if I ask you that you speak about your project and also about the link, because the Duisburg Mission Foundation and we have the same aim. We try to save as much as we can planetary life and the life in the land and the oceans. This is our common aim. And so it's wonderful that you have a contribution with us, but you also have a big work with Duisburg Mission. So I would like to speak about the project and also the link. What is your contribution here and what is your contribution there? Please, John and Anne-Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear us? Thank you, Peter and Bruno. The instigation to think the ocean really came at the opening of Reset Modernity by Francesca and Marcus, who walked into the exhibition. The way in which we are thinking the ocean in the Anthropocene, of course, is owing so much to the work of our friends, the geologists in the Anthropocene Working Group. And geology is nothing else than the accumulation of sea strata and the ways in which it sediments on the bottom of the sea indicates the different stages of life on our planet. And so that's when we started thinking that the extension of human activity is having as much impact in the deepest part of the ocean as it has on land, and there's no real distinction. And of course, Bruno is always such an instigator in making us think completely in a different way the relationship between entities. And so we've been trying to keep up with this thinking when he started telling us about the critical zone. I wanted to share very quickly my screen so that I can show you some of the images that we're discussing here. Let me do this. I'll do it like this, and I will press play. The first thing I wanted to show you very quickly is some images of the first show, the Museum of Oil show at ZKM, and you see the gigantic images are nothing else than areas of large extraction and territories that have been completely reshaped by oil and the risk that the oil gives onto not only what we used to call nature, but on our economies. When we're thinking of the Ocean in Transformation project, what we are started to understand is really the fact that oil is responsible for a major juridical transformation as well as environmental, economic, and complete destruction of our modern life. The juridical.
What do we see here, John? What do we see here?
Yeah, the juridical change has to do with spaces like this one. And this is a high-resolution bathymetric scan of the North American continental shelf that you see in gray, and then the continental slope reaching down into the abyss of the Atlantic. And everything that is in gray is basically conceptualized as being the extension, the juridical extension of the coastal state. There's a very important set of juridical structures that lead to the establishment of the exclusive economic zone, whereby the continental states have unique access to natural resources in that space, all the way down basically to the abyss. The idea is that there's no distinction between land and water. But as you can see in this image that we've reproduced out of very complex scientific data, the idea is also that there's no water. When the extractive economy is thinking of taking out oil and gas from the continental shelf, they are thinking really the spaces of the marine life as if they will be devoid of the ocean. They're just imagining that they can flatten out everything. And it's a space that the ocean becomes invisible. It's made invisible via a very complex set of operations of extraction. And so our project that we present at ZKM is part of a larger research that TBA21 Academy has commissioned us, and we've been collaborating with TBA21 Academy. Marcus and Francesca has been so inspiring. Is focusing on thinking that there is an impossibility of thinking that space as empty, as devoid of activity, in spite of all the attempts by the economy to make it look as if it's another space. So here what you see is a combination of multiple data sets, and you are looking at the North Sea and the Great Britain and the continent of Europe, and you see that the entire areas that are of the North Sea are completely engulfed in extractive industries and or marine protected areas, or the little leftovers of the fishing areas. And what we've done here is to try to understand how a multiplicity of research and exploration technologies are at the same time the ecological technologies that are mapping and scanning these lands. We indicate here in black a cut at 200 meters, because between minus 200 meters, where photosynthesis can still happen underwater, and 200 meters is somehow the most sensitive part of the Earth system, what the scientists start calling the Earth system. It is where the transformation of sea level rise affect mostly the trophic cascade. That means the chains of food, which in a counterintuitive way go from the sea upwards. And it's not only that the nutrients go downwards, but they really climb from the sea all the way upwards. And it also shows that the human space, the metropolitan spaces, are completely entangled with these spaces of the maritime and the marine spaces. And we also see, in this case, it's 1 year of data. We see the seasonality of the changes on land and in the sea. We see the algae bloom. We see the blossoming of photosynthesis in the seas. And we see how not only the ocean is so much more dynamic than the land, but it's still unfortunately engulfed in this idea of invisibility. It is usually we see the surface of the ocean, we see the horizon, but it's so difficult to conceptualize being immersed in the ocean. And Francesca Thyssen-Bonamiz and Marcus Raymond are maybe the most adamant advocates of being immersed in the oceans in order to completely shift the mind away from this idea of inert space. The continental shelf is also the area that is the most important for homeostasis of the climate. It's where carbon is captured at the planetary level. Peter, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted
Bruno first. Yeah.
Sorry?
Bruno, yeah.
No, I wanted to point out very interesting features of your map, where the land, I mean, the continental land is not actually visible. Because the argument that you made, which is so powerful on the sea, which is a cartographic version taking the water out, would actually be exactly the same on the continental geographical view, which takes the soil out and basically all the life forms out in the cartographic inventory. So if you had on, for example, we just saw Italy here, if you were doing a continuous map of the continental part and of the sea part, we will realize that the land is actually as made invisible as the water in the sea. And it would be quite striking to see that the two essential features, the land on which we live, and especially the soil, and the water in which the sea actually lives, are invisibilized, I mean, made invisible by the extractive industry. This was just a way to sort of insist on one of the features of your beautiful data set. Sorry to have intervened.
Absolutely. I think this idea of there's a machine that of vision that makes all of these spaces invisible.
Yeah, right. I think it's
really important. A machine is not only that they are removed from our usual understanding as, say, a normal European citizen would imagine the ocean as being far away or a space that is detached. But I think what is really at play is the fact that it's so populated and so full of machines that they extract makes it a space that is invisible. In particular, the continental shelf is a space that is invisible also politically. It is relegated in obscure negotiation about licenses and extractive economy, but the entire population that used to be on the coast has been, so to say, made invisible as well. And that's why it's becoming more and more clear that the populations on the coast are the ones that are mostly suffering of the removal of the ocean and the land from our imaginary.
I would like to confirm and repeat what you and Bruno have said, because when I first saw this really astonishing map, I was shocked that there's no water. Then I realized precisely this is an architecture of extraction. And that this architecture of extraction is normally invisible because it is hidden underwater. Huh? And this was my first shock to see, oh la la, there's an invisible architecture of extraction. So these people, this company, just since the biofilm, the continental crust, is for them only a zone of extraction. But then, correctly, came my second shock, what Bruno said, that even the land becomes invisible, no? Not only the water. Huh? And how could you extract all this data? How could you visualize this data? Huh?
The question is.
It's a very important aspect of the work of territorial agency at large, that all of this is publicly available information. And it is always important to understand that the information is available. The technology that we use to visualize it is equally available. It's open source. And but it is siloed. It is contained in very expert websites and resources of university or research labs and sometimes governments or the European Union. And it's so difficult to bring them to visibility. And the work of TBA 21 Academy that we've been collaborating with is really so much engaged in making public what public information is. And this is all already public. And I think it's important to understand also that part of the work has been to create a space of collaboration where we bring the different silos together and we show them the images, and the different scientists and policymakers and groups of fishermen and the indigenous populations that we've been talking with, because this is a project that spans really all of the oceans, then start collaborating and talking in a different way by looking at these images.
What are we seeing here, John?
I'll show it again. This is the work that has been done by the European Union to make available all the human activities. And we put it together on a year base. So you start seeing, it's very difficult to orient. This is, I don't know if you see my mouse, this is Scandinavia.
Yeah.
This is Great Britain. This area here is the North Sea, and this is Germany, and Karlsruhe is up here. And all of these blue lines are trawling. That means it's over 1 year. It's like driving a bulldozer through a forest in order to catch some blueberries, is the comparison that has been made by scientists. And this is like scraping the bottom of the sea, and in order to catch crabs and fish and the European Union talks about being an enlightened ecological governance of the sea, but we know very well that it's one of the most complicated situations of overfishing and complete destruction of the fisheries that we have.
You mean that they have data on every boat and every ship and every trailer?
Yeah, this is also combined with fantastic work by different organizations, and we collaborated with an organization called the Global Fishing Watch that detects the automatic identification system of ships by satellites, and then with the use of the computers of Google and artificial intelligence, they detect the pattern of movement, and they can see whether it's a fishing activity, if it's a line fishing, it's trolling, transshipment. I would like to indicate here that what happens is that the activity are at the edge of the exclusive economic zones. And there is international waters, of course, on top of the exclusive economic zones. But beyond the exclusive economic zone is the so-called area, which is the heritage of humankind. That is the area where everybody can fish. And that is really where all the nasty things are starting to happen, both by fishing and deep sea mining beyond the continental shelf.
What you mean this is the good version? This is the polite, civilized version.
Yeah, and there's an attachment, of course, to an idea of enlightenment in Europe and the connotation with the imperial structures of enlightenment that is happening in the rest of the world. So the more Europe becomes green enlightened, the more we see nasty things happening in the rest of the world.
Now, Francesca and Marcus, when I understood correctly, you met Territorial Agency in the exhibition at Reset Modernity, and you immediately started to discuss not the extraction of land, but the extraction what happens in the ocean. Why did you immediately change the subject from land to ocean in this very moment?
Yeah.
Well, because we have started at the time, we'd already established the TVA 21 Academy, which is totally 100% focused on the ocean. And this has already started a few years ago. It's as the exploratory soul of TVA 21. It so wanted to break with the traditional techniques of exhibition making and the rigors and the routine of exhibition making that other art institutions have, and focus more on research and actually bringing a lot of disciplines together. And what struck us about the project that we saw at the ZKM was the incredible amount of correlation of data that John and Anne-Sophie had put together, and the visualization of it, because I think it's most of the issues that exist today, if we just take the environmental ones, they're just too huge for most people to get their heads around. And also the media blows a lot of these into sort of sensationalist stories, which actually push people even further away. And we fundamentally believe that the language of art and, of course, architecture is there to really bring these massive scale issues into something that is comprehensible somehow. And to do it in a powerful way. That all of this data that John, and there are 7 trajectories that are available and can be seen at Ocean Space in Venice at the end of August. All of these actually are evidence. I think this is, at the end of the day, how does this make a difference? How does this move people to think about this differently? Is it so much of oceanographic research is very compartmentalized? It's dislocated from our atmospheric studies and the weather patterns, and it's, you know, so much of everybody's studying in their specialized fields in science, and art can transcend all of these different disciplines and actually bring all of this data together. And it's, none of this is fake, as John just said. It's really, everything is open source. It's all available data. It's not streaming data. We don't need it. It's just under a year old. But the facts are, and they speak for themselves. And once you visualize all of that, it is so shocking. And also to take away the ocean, to take away the water from the ocean really helps people understand the scale of what's been going on, because underneath that otherwise very reflective blue shield of what is, actually representing 3.5 billion cubic miles of water, which represent a massive amount of the biomass and the life on Earth. And in particular, in that twilight zone beyond 200 meters that John was talking about, where 90% of the fish biomass exists, which is why these trawlers are creating such havoc. I think that to be able to start to understand the scale of the extraction and the scale of the damage is only the beginning in trying to shape policy making. And that is the departure that TVA wanted to make. I always believed that art has a tremendous amount to contribute to global opinions and shaping people's understanding of things, but not the way people describe it for the last few decades, as it's a nice reflection of the world we live in. I'm not interested in creating a reflection of the world that we live in. I really want us to be confronted with the world that we live in and understand it better. And if that's getting too close to the reality of things and maybe a shimmer closer to activism or advocacy in that sense, then I'm perfectly happy to take that on board, because that's the way I feel that art has this powerful role in actually shaping people's understanding of things.
A very clear, one moment, a very clear answer. I see you have been interested already in the ocean as one of the most important life spaces. Then you saw the show and realized these people have the ability to collect an enormous, massive amount of data and to visualize them in a perfect artistic way. Then you had the idea, maybe this is what they did for the land, they can do for the ocean. Huh? Correct?
At the time, we were deeply involved with Armin Linke, who we had commissioned to go on a 3-year research commission called Prospecting Ocean, which I believe is
which is also in our show. Your wonderful film is also in our show. Thank you.
And so Armin drills down on this little known endeavor called deep sea mining, right? And all that makes it so little known, right? It is, again, it's another fact of making invisible through design, through making it remote, through making it completely unrelatable in what is called the common heritage of humankind in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. But it's a detail, right? And by studying this detail, we also realize that within the ocean, everything is being very siloed, and there is no interconnection between the different disciplines, between legal systems, between even jurisdictions, and so on and so on. And so by seeing John's and Anne-Sophie's work that makes all of these connections transparent and makes the effort that we need to make to leave the oil in the ground so visible, right? That was the big reveal, to say, okay, now we understand the invisibility, and here are two people with teams that can make all of these invisible connections visible, right? And then becomes, and I think that goes back to the conversations that I imagine Anne-Sophie and John and Bruno have been having since a while, right? Is to treat all of these matters of concern and matters of care and make these relationships visible, right? Which goes then the next level, right? It's not just infrastructure, or it's not just a physical infrastructure. All of these infrastructures have meaning, and they build larger meaning. So that was really the striking realization after seeing that work.
Michael, you are correct. Bruno Latour wrote a book even called From Matters of Fact to Matters of Concern. Bruno, right?
Did I? Wow.
Yeah, one of them. But Marcus and Francesca, what is saw from the work of Territorial Agency? How do you see it? Where and where? Can I show it now? Can I see it now in Venice, this work, and how is it installed?
So you can see it in Venice as an installation from the 27th of August onwards, right? This is our second
the month.
Yeah, second season at Ocean Space. It is, it's a challenging season. Has been postponed after, we wanted to open at the end of March. But so that's the physical installation that you will be able to see, which is a field of monitors, and I imagine a very, very strong, impactful installation.
So in your space, the church in Venezia. How long will it be open? How long?
This year until the 29th of November, and then we will open again next year, as responding to the postponement of the architectural biennial.
With the same installation.
With the same installation.
Wonderful.
There's a cohabitation of the space. We will announce later, but territorial agency you will also find next year.
Okay, then I go back to another. Yeah, Francesca.
About all of these images that you have been seeing with these strange stripes across the bottom of the ocean, these are all done through sonic reflections created by the oil industry that are searching the bottom of the ocean for resources and as well for deep sea mining. And this causes the most extraordinary amount of sound pollution in the ocean, which has a massive impact on the biomass from the zooplankton all the way to the whales. And I think also one important part of this exhibition is to imagine this. We look at the Anthropocenic impact in the oceans, not on the oceans, but within the ocean and its depth. I really also like very much the fact that we can now visualize the incredible amount of sound pollution that goes up to 250 decibels in order to measure these depths and to look for these manganese nodules that are so precious to our rare earth. So, I mean, also try to imagine when you see this exhibition, to imagine the impact that we're making sonically as well in the ocean. Thank you.
Just to follow up on this, the whole body of research or a lot of the body of research that has gone into the work, you can currently find on Ocean Archive, which is a digital platform. And over the past 10 weeks, we've kind of unfolded trajectory after trajectory and the body of research that goes with it.
Dina Korintenberg, we have some questions from Telegram.
Yeah, I would like to introduce a comment by one of our most loyal followers in the Telegram group, who's Marce, who came last week to ZKM from Copenhagen by bicycle and train. And it's very interesting because he
I repeat it, there's one follower who wants to be part of this exhibition. He came by bicycle from Denmark to Hamburg, and from Hamburg to Torre, just to see our exhibition. Stays there for several days.
Right.
Yeah, and he really makes an interesting connection to what we were talking about, that also what Francesca was a bit pointing at, to confront people and how to move people or create an awareness for what is out of our sensorium or of our visibility. And what is also the Critical Zone exhibition is dealing a lot with this moment of disorientation and reorientation. So Marce is writing, it's shocking actually how alien that ocean map was. It took me a long time to convince myself that it even is a map and what the scale is, until recognizing the soul of the Italian boot. Implication need to become familiar with oceanographic maps. And I think it's super interesting how his first reaction was to the work by Territorial Agency, which is really pointing to this moment of alienation or disorientation, and then a process needed really to get familiar with a new or a different mode and type of awareness and sensitivity, and how you can then translate this sensitivity to political or societal action.
Okay, I would like to continue these ideas. by summarizing, following an argument of Brunner Tour, and he said, we don't see the water. Abstractly, we all agree that the ocean is the most important, maybe the most important component for life on our planet. Yeah? That means, Bruno, when we speak in the abstract terms, the invisibility of the water means, in fact, an annihilation of the ocean. And this means, in fact, an annihilation of life. Therefore, I ask the Territorial Agency, when you did this work, was it not also shocking for you to realize that this tendency to annihilate the water, to annihilate the ocean, also means finally, in consequence, an annihilation of life? And I think this was the reason why Thyssen and Missa just was so proud to find this object. So I have two questions to you, Territorial Agency, and to you, Francesca and Marco.
But okay.
Or Bruno, answer. Huh?
No, I cannot answer the question directly, but I'm very interested in the fact that the two exhibitions we did, one last time and this time, give what Dipesh Chakrabarty calls a planetary regime, which means that there are people who see neither the land nor the sea.
Yeah.
And it's the same problem in both cases. And the second thing I find very interesting is that critical zone as a concept was invented by scientists where, as Marco said, worried that when you study a piece of soil, water, trees, etc., you are in silos. And critical zone was supposed to replace the notion of rivers, the notion of air and life and so on and so forth. So there might be something interesting to take from their experience in gathering data set and gathering discipline in critical zone observatories to see what could be done for the sea, where the notion of observatories as a local site is, of course, more difficult. And the difference is, of course, they would say, my friend in critical zone, continental critical zone, that every meters or every 2 meters in a soil is different from 2 meters next to it. But the turbulence of the water means you can actually take data on much larger scale. And it's a technical question which would be interesting to see. But overall, on the scientific difference between Earth and sea, I'm amazed by this sort of cartographic capacity to make things invisible, and consider in the set, which is in the show, this amazing thing in Territorial Agency set about the basically the transportation of boundaries, legal boundaries, on the deep floor, which means that there is no sea, but there is no land either. I mean, it's just legal. A legal grid, so to speak, which is laid out on both the sea and the land. So since our show is about landing on Earth, it's called about earthly politics. It means in both cases, you have to replace a sort of idealistic version of what it is to be on Earth, which has no soil and no water, so to speak.
Yep.
So the combination of the two is actually very striking.
Yeah. Sean?
I think one of the things that are really important that Territorial Agency addressed was the fact that they looked at the 200 meters above sea level to the 200 meters below. And of course, much of their research also went beyond that. But I think that's where most of us understand the life on Earth exists. And in the oceans, it goes far deeper, and there are much bigger variety of species in a depth beyond that. But the life on Earth that we know and understand is in this very minute, thin line of 200 meters above and 200 meters below. This is the extraordinary, what they have outlined and the impact that these two areas have on one another. That's very important as well, the way we perceive this.
Well, I think the the striking thing is that Bruno started his answer by saying he wanted to fully integrate the ocean into the critical zone exhibition. And this is, you know, for us as liking to think of ourselves as educated beings, and to have to drive home the fact that the ocean, which is, as Peter rightfully said, the largest maker of climate on the one hand, on the other hand, covers 72% of the planet, right? And we need to remind ourselves that this is maybe an important geographical feature of the critical zone, speaks to our absolute illiteracy in terms of all things ocean. John.
I just wanted to say that the zone that Francesca brought up, this is what surprised us most heartbreakingly in the project was when we realized sea level rise in this very line between land and water. Firstly, as architects, we discovered that nobody really knows where the line is, because architects always want to hold on to a baseline. And we realized that whatever data sets we have, they are not matching at all about this line. So there needs to be new research about how we actually define land and water. And the second thing was when we then take one model, the digital elevation model of the globe, and we put in what our politicians agreed on in Paris to 2 degrees, what that will affect on land with sea level rise. That was very heartbreaking to see that 1.5 billion people will have to move on land in order to survive.
Besides, Sean, can you a little bit speak more about your experience when you discovered that the border between land and sea, land and ocean, is even a juridical and legislative problem? How was your experience here?
It comes really from a long frequentation with the problem of the freedom of the sea. And it's the way in which Europe has conceptualized imperialism. And it comes from a very interesting legal case in 1604 when basically the Dutch seized a major prize in the coast of what is today Indonesia, just off the coast of Sumatra. And it was a Spanish ship that was stranded on a shoal, and the Dutch took it. And then they had to defend legally that they had the right to keep the prize. And it was the equivalent of the national product of the entire Netherlands. It was a gigantic price of colonialism. And famously, Hugo Grotius argued that there's an inherent right of everyone to visit everyone out of friendship. It's a similar argument as Immanuel Kant's notion of cosmopolitanism. It talks equally about the sphere, it talks about the globe, and the fact that you cannot limit the movement of people. And that is the way in which the structures of law and colonialism, in particular law of the sea and colonialism, go hand in hand. Counter to that, there has always been the model of the British and the Venetians of the closed sea that is dominated by one maritime structures. And you start seeing that the entire notion of geopolitics really hinges around this question of the openness or the closure of the sea. What is interesting, maybe for those who are more into the particular histories of Europe, is that it's really around Karlsruhe and the regions of the Rhine that this idea of territory, in particular of bonded territory, was conceptualized at the end of the wars of religion, and that gave rise to the Westphalian peace. And we have a deep interest, of course, in notions of territory, and we're really interested in understanding how to move away from that bonded idea. Territories are still conceptualized as maps, and not as the lived spaces of multiple species operating and communicating with one another in order to remain alive. And
it is actually one of the big aspects of a critical zone exhibition. is to try to see what happens when you don't have boundaries but overlaps. And a great part of a work, which is on Lynn Margulis and of course Jim Lovelock, is about the non-separability of entity, which doesn't mean they are very nice and cooperating with one another, but they overlap. And of course, the question of the sea and the land on that, and the legal difficulty, which is also taken at length in the catalogue of the exhibition, is right into this thing you mentioned. And of course, the man who would not have been surprised by the legal extension of a free, so-called free sea is Carl Schmitt, because that's the whole idea of debunking the idea of freedom of sea is what Schmitt did. And the whole legal, reading your work and seeing your data set, I imagine the complete enthusiasm of Carl Schmitt in seeing in space, I mean, visually in space, the materialization of his argument.
With the added difficulty that he still believes somehow in the elements, in foundational elements. The land and the sea will be distinct and clearly distinct. But
right, and you show it's not. Yes, but it's neither land nor sea, which is what I get from our conversation, which is so interesting. It's another planetary regime, so to speak.
It becomes even more evident when you think about the reclamation of land and what that means legally, or the disappearance of islands, what that means economically and legally as well, right? There's always an interest that drives one or the other. We see it in the South China Sea, but we also see it in the Pacific, what is happening with the disappearance of land or the reclamation of land, and therefore extending your national waters.
Boundaries, yeah.
John, what I learned also from your stories, that we know that land is a battleground of ideology and of war. People always conquer land, huh? But now we realize that we have also a hidden and invisible history of ideological background, which is the ocean. Huh? We have this fantasy of the free ocean, and people can withdraw text, living on boats on the ocean, etc. But now I learn what you do precisely with the ocean, what we do with our show, Critical Zones, that Bruno, we redirect the view. Normally people want to escape into the sky, yeah? And the paradise is the sky, and the hell is in the ground. And now we say, no, down to earth. Yeah? We must redirect our view. And I think what you do also now, you redirect the view, what is an ocean? Yeah? And normally this ocean was, this ideology, a free land, yeah? And it has a freedom, but now we learn it's a terrible ideological battleground. Yeah?
I mean, there's a little text in the exhibition that says that there's no peace in the ocean.
There's no
There's no peace.
There's no peace. Wonderful. Says one. There's no peace in the ocean.
No peace in the ocean. And
that's a wonderful sentence. A wonderful sentence, Francesca. No?
Unfortunately, there's no.
Oh la la. There's no peace in the ocean.
No. In spite of a film, the first film I saw was Commandant Cousteau film, which was called in French Le Monde du Silence.
The monde is not the word of silence.
It's not silent
the word
anymore,
of silence.
and it's not silence. Peaceful anymore. It's like
that's a marvelous, very important discovery, John. And Anne-Sophie, very important.
And for us, the entire discussion, for instance, around Schmitt and the enmity is so central on many levels, and how to avert a war of all against all is really the asymptote of any kind of intellectual life. And really, what we start understanding is not only that there are multiple ways of being at sea, but that there's been a predominant way of being at sea that has taken away many modes of being, many cultures. And an amazing thing of working with Francesca and Marcus is that they have a fantastic network around them. And we were able to speak with people in Fiji, people in the great oceanic states of the Pacific, people in Papua New Guinea. And suddenly we understand that there is so many other worlds, so many concepts of the ocean. And the one that we're describing is really predominantly continental European understanding of the ocean. I grew up in the mountains, but half my family is British, and I understand what it means to be coming from a country that still imagines and dreams of ruling the waves. It's exactly the same dream as ruling the land of the nationalist. It's an imagined world, and it's an imagined land. It's an imagined sea, and it's an imagined land. But it always remains just on the top, on the surface. And what we discovered in a very strange way in a discussion on the Pacific was the effects that, for instance, attempts to keep peace during the Cold War had on the Pacific Islanders. There was a moment when a fantastic speaker from Fiji told us, in order to have world peace, we had the atomic bomb tests in the Pacific. And this is exactly what we mean by invisibility. No? There was a gigantic political making invisible the largest region of the planet. It just didn't exist. And the Pacific is never on the maps. It's just at the edge of the maps. The Arctic is at the edge of the map. And this is really the difficulty of inhabiting a culture that has somehow invented the globe. In particular, the Mercator charts are really so ingrained in our way of understanding our planet that it's inescapable. Everybody will understand this as it instead of as a very complex representation. And so what we did to counter this is to start thinking it in media terms. We understand the ocean as being a mediator. It's sensing as much as we're trying to sense it. It registers activity and it has a memory. And it is asynchronous. It's not frameable. It is discontinuous. And I think these are all concepts that come from the arts, come from the visual understanding and spatial understanding. But we need to throw them back at a geopolitical understanding of the world.
Bruno, you invented the term, the slogan, down to earth. But now realize we have to make a sequel together with Francesca and Marcus, deep into the ocean. Must be our next project.
Indeed.
Okay. Do we have some questions from Telegram?
No, for the moment, not too many, but yeah, I wanted to ask a bit on the translation work you do. You deal with so many different kinds of data and data sets. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on the process you've gone through during the last 3 years of your work? That would be super interesting, I think. And another point I would be very interested in is making visible or sensitive is like the first step, and the next step, like activating a public or bringing together a public. Maybe you could also elaborate a bit on that point with regards to a second step to yeah, how to get a practice out of what you sense, or yeah, a kind of transformation or change in how we live within this critical zone.
The way in which the ocean is measured is really to be understood as part of the vast machine, which Paul and Edwards described in a fantastic book. There is through basically the 19th century, developing from there all the way to the contemporary models of climate change, there's been a huge development of coordination of measurements. What has happened in history, of course, is that everyone who's navigating the ocean will take daily measurements about their position, but they will at the same time measure visibility, the wind, in order to chart their way. So the entire historical data about basically the empires, the the British, the French, and so on. Navigating is part of the record that guarantees a lot of the contemporary climate change models to be, appropriate, to be calibrated. What contemporary scientists are doing is that they have a general understanding of circulation, and they have a general understanding of the relationship between life at sea or in sea and the transformation of the planet. And we had a fantastic series of discussion with scientists that look at how the emergence of the Isthmus of Panama, and Jeremy Jackson looked at how the emergence of the Isthmus of Panama and the closure of the link between the tropical seas, between the Pacific and the Atlantic, is really at the basis of our contemporary understanding of climate change. And it's because of the circulation models that they understood that it's not possible to give an account of contemporary levels of climatic transformation without understanding that it's driven by carbon fossils. The way that we do it is really trying to understand that the measurements that all the scientists are taking, all these general understanding and specific understanding that they take, are so fragmented. But once you start putting them together, you have technically a few difficulties. First of all, they are not synchronous, the data sets. They follow different protocols. They are completely, sometimes, actually the majority of scientific data lies on hard drives in the cupboards of the scientists. It's so difficult because of the machinery of science to get the scientists actually to share their data. But the data that is shared is usually open access, but not open data. And this may be for ZKM an important distinction. Open access means that you can basically put up an account for free and download it and do whatever you want with the data. And this is what we've done. We've created a lot of accounts on many servers around the world and started downloading the data, or sometimes creating APIs that we would interface it with. But open data against open access data would mean a complete revolution in how we have an understanding of science. Open data is data that you can access without having to register, without having to explain who you are and what you're going to do with the data. And this will require enormous efforts of synchronization and the coordination among the different gatherers of data. A very simple example is that the headers of the data sets, which are usually in comma-separated value files, the headers, if they don't follow the correct protocols, are incompatible one with the other. And what we have to do is then put them together manually most of the time, try to understand the time scale, the spatial differential, and this is what we call the normalization of the data sets. But what we are ultimately interested in is the gaps between the data. To show, for instance, that the resolution at land is 300 times higher than the resolution at sea is really important. We know so little of the ocean. It's the majority of our planet, but we have nothing about it. The coastal areas are even more complicated because you need to go back and forward so many more times than in the larger swathes of deep sea. But even there, at the deep sea, we don't have any data. There's a fantastic initiative by the Nippon Foundation, together with the United Nations and UNESCO, to challenge. It's a challenge to map the entirety of the seabed by in the next 10 years, which is at the same time an amazing idea, but it's so scary because we know that with all this data, in particular, and the sounding data that Francesca has been talking about, and she's done an amazing piece called Sounds Too Many, that I really encourage everyone to find on the internet, and it's on Ocean Archive. it means that we will destroy more and more. And this is really the crazy situation we're in. In order to know more, we're destroying more. And this is really the difficult part.
Bettina, just to follow up on this and give you a little example and insight into the journey that we've all been on, we got an invitation to the first meeting of the Ocean Data Alliance at the United Nations. And there were sitting, you know, heads of institutions on the European side, on the American side. And John gave a presentation, and he gave an insight into, it was at the time was not a finished trajectory, but it was you know, a moment towards the end. And funnily enough, although we made very transparent that this is all open access data, right? So data provided by their institutions, right? The fact that it was presented by an architect led immediately to the question, but how precise is this? Right? Although before that, they showed us graphs and figures that were so imprecise that you were like, what does this mean, what you're showing us? The one that was like super legible, very precise and accurate was like immediately, well, but wait a minute, you're an architect. This is like, how precise is this actually? Right? So this is the kind of battle that you also then need to fight out once you leave the exhibition space.
Yeah.
Okay.
The burden of architecture.
If you have no other question, I will slowly close the doors of the Terrestrial University by thanking Marcus and Francesca, by thanking you, Anne-Sophie and John, and thanking Bruno, and thanking Bettina. Thank you so much. And above all, I want to thank all the people in the online universe who listened to us and who will reframe our ideas which we have articulated, and will multiply them and distribute them. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, John.
See you in the show, I hope,
Yeah.
Yes.
at some point.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.